So I'm just going to run through what we've looked at the regulators a little bit. We'll go back to them, but I just want to look at, in terms of food safety management systems, what trends are we picking up? What are we seeing that could come through that obviously we would need to look at, but we would need to maybe consider in terms of how will our standards or regulations change, and what has influenced this? Obviously COVID, but other things as well. Okay, can I get that to move? Okay, so I'm going to talk about 3 things. It's not a exhaustive list, because just a brief summary, but we're looking at food safety culture, food fraud, and technology. Fourth industrial revolutions have been disrupted or progressed a lot faster because of where we are and when we are. So first and foremost, food safety culture. What are the standards saying about these? And we know that GFSI, in their last update, so GFSI version 2020, put in food safety culture, and a lot of the standards have adopted this. So we know there's a greater onus on facilities to make sure that they have a food safety culture plan, that it's something that we are going to look for and check for in audits, and it is not just a compliance thing. So it's a, what is the word I want to use, a vibe. You know, what is the atmosphere at the facility, and do people really understand their role in terms of food safety? We know that BRC has made this just a section in their standards, so it's specifically food safety culture, whereas FSSC has said, because ISO 22000:2018 has sections that speak to the requirements of a food safety plan, there's no specific need to create a section. So when you look at, or if you're an auditor for FSSC 22000 or ISO 22000, it's a bit of a holistic approach. You will be looking at certain clauses and saying, okay, this is what the clause wants, but how does that speak to the culture of the facility? So we want to be able to understand where that is coming from. So food safety culture, we know that's there. And then towards the middle end of last year, Codex also updated the food hygiene guideline, which covers the HACCP section. And food safety culture is a distinct section there. So we know from that food safety culture is here to stay. It's not a phase. It's definitely something that we're going to be putting through all of our standards, and it might be something that we might need to put at local levels as well. And then we need to talk about food fraud. So food fraud is in our standards. We have an idea of what it is. It's the economically motivated adulteration of food products, and the estimated cost in the last year alone was about $50 billion. And then we've theoretically looked at food fraud. We've put in place our controls and mitigation measures depending on which standard you have. But a lot of people have said, because the coronavirus pandemic created this perfect storm of incidents. We had supply chain pressures, we have demand pressures in terms of ingredients, we have logistical issues in terms of how can you get your ingredients that before we had long supply chains, but now your long supply chain might be interrupted because of whether or not a border is closed or not. It's made it very stressful on businesses, and all of these, criminologists tell us, puts pressure or encourages or creates the right environment for fraud to be more likely. So the expectation from a desktop exercise would be that fraud incidents are going to go up. And those that monitor them, and we have data coming in slowly from various organizations that monitor food fraud, that definitely between the periods of about April, or if you're going to measure specific pandemic times from December 2019 through to about April or June 2020, there was a significant increase in that. And the response in terms of our standards, so if we look at FSSC 22000 version 5.1, also as a response to a GFSI requirement, is that they now have an additional requirement that asks you, in terms of your procurement controls, to have procurement procedures for emergency situations. So this is not only a COVID response, but it is strongly linked to that. So above and beyond your normal controls in terms of who is my supplier, are they supplying well, can I trust my supplier, we're also looking at how did you go about purchasing? Because obviously in an emergency scenario, borders are closed, you need an ingredient or a raw material, you need a new supplier, you have a process for that, but what happens in an emergency? Like what rules go out the window, or, you know, we're not in the window. So food fraud, we know, is here to stay, but obviously it's going to get more stringent, especially because COVID is here for a little while longer. So we need to understand how that's going to affect us. Our new normal, you know, we're a bit more comfortable in some of it, but there will still be aspects where you thought the borders were open and then all of a sudden you don't have enough. Or if you overstock, or an intermediary overstocks, you know, what happens to the pricing of those ingredients? So the potential for food fraud, the incidence of it definitely gone up. The COVID effect, as some would call it, is there. And then we need to see in terms of our actual systems, because previously for some ingredients, the systems were tested, but definitely COVID has pushed everyone into the realm of, are you sure that you are getting what you actually purchased? And are you sure of the risk in terms of what could happen to that ingredient? So there is, to a certain extent, an increased monitoring need. In some cases, it might be an increased need for testing, but it's also allowed for opportunities for closer markets. So especially if most of your suppliers were overseas and you've now had to source local, some would say that is a win for many things, the environment, for sustainability, for a lot of other aspects that we would need to have in place. But it's a consideration in terms of how do our supply chains work and how can we make them more effective in terms of preventing food fraud, so that we know what we're getting. And then the last aspect that again has been, I think the word I wanted before was accelerated, again by the COVID pandemic, is the promoted use of ICT in food safety management systems. So this is not something we didn't have. We did have the allowance for the use of ICT in audits. You know, there was a little bit of use of webinars, we were getting there, but obviously it was accelerated or pushed forward due to this process that we have been in of trying to deal with the pandemic and not going out and all of these things. So version 5.1 clarified the use of ICT in terms of audits. So that update said, previously it said, okay, you can use ICT, but we weren't really sure on when and how and what are the rules regarding that. So we've gotten a bit more clarity in terms of that. And then we also have clearer rules in terms of e-learning. So for training organizations, you know, how e-learning works, you know, how platforms like this can be used to educate employees and what are the requirements in terms of those have been clarified as well. It's important to note that the Global Food Safety Initiative, GFSI, is still thinking and working on in terms of their stance in how far auditing will be acceptable in terms of fully certifying organizations. So FSSC, for example, offers ICT. You can do partial or full remote audits, but only the partial audit would be fully GFSI benchmarked. And we're still waiting. So GFSI, unfortunately, their conference is at the end of March. So we will still retroactively see what they have to say and where they're going. But we do know that it is something they've considered or are considering and looking at and listening to all sides of the argument. In terms of cybersecurity, in terms of technology, the other trend we saw was an increased opportunities for cyber threats. So we know that there was an increase, whatever type of business you had, in terms of people trying to hack or ransomware, all of those things. Previous version of BRC, so current version of BRC, sorry, version 8 emphasizes cybersecurity as a major risk factor and what controls need to be put in place. So we know that this is something that, again, because we have been pushed into this technological framework, it's very important that we also make sure that we have controls around that, and we know that it is a significant risk factor. The opportunities from technology, obviously, if you're doing a benchtop audit, if you're training online, you reduce travel time, there's a lot of other things. But we also know that there's an opportunity in terms of traceability, and this speaks to the food fraud element, as well as making sure that we have an understanding. So technology in traceability is something that we are likely to see growing. So systems that will allow for full traceability throughout the supply chain and linkages throughout the supply chain is also something we expect to see in terms of how food safety management systems are going to handle that. Because obviously, if I'm auditing one organization, they have traceability in their unit, but if they are linked to additional units, how do we address that? And what are the controls that we need to put in place? So these are just a few of the things that we're looking forward to, and the systems themselves are adapting. So our food safety management systems are always supposed to be dynamic. We see that they are going in these directions, and we can see some of the writing on the wall. But obviously there will be some surprises. But this is what we expect to a certain extent to be pushed a bit more, clarified a bit more, and the standards are giving us the room to do this.
Thank you,
yeah,
Mutsa.
so that's neat.
I'm not so sure we're all looking forward to it. Maybe some of us are looking more forward to it than others, that being the auditors. But I think what is very clear is how quickly food safety management systems are moving away from the regulatory space. And what I mean by that is just the rate of change and the fact that regulatory is just not keeping up, which is a little unfortunate, and I think a real risk within our country that we will definitely have to do something about.